Hey guys. So our second step in our Renaissance chapter is to talk about religion. So thus far, when we have talked about the church, the Christian church has only been Catholic. Catholic is the only branch of Christianity that existed up to this point. Um, Now, we had talked about how there was the schism or the split. We had the Catholic Church had split basically into the eastern and western parts. So the church, the Catholics had split, but it was still the only type of Christianity that there was. But that's going to change during this chapter. So as we get started here, we're going to see the birth of a couple of different types of Christianity. So first of all, over here, this is what we call the Protestant Reformation. So Reformation basically means to reform something. So they want to make changes or reform the church. And so this is where we're going to see that second branch of Christianity. The Protestants are going to be born during this time. So why? Why are we seeing a change in the church? Well, first of all, it's because we've already talked about how there was a whole lot of corruption going on in the church. It's really unfortunate, but it was the case. So we had these monks and these priests and all these different people in the church who were supposed to be, living these very simple lives. They take these vows of celibacy and these vows of poverty, and yet they are wearing jewels and they are wearing gold and they are taking money from the peasants, and instead of using it for the church and the poor people, they're pocketing it. So we're seeing a lot of corruption that was going on in the church. And of course, we talked about how the church was supposed to be maintaining those issues themselves, right? Because we had the fight going on between Henry and Thomas Becket about who should be allowed to be put on trial. And Henry felt like if the church people break the rules, they needed to be put on trial. But the church is like, no, we take care of it. But of course, what did we say happened? They were sort of sweeping everything under the rug and nothing was really happening. So if no one ever gets punished for breaking the rules, change will never really happen. So that's sort of what we're seeing here. The Protestants are going to be, this is going to start with a movement to stop the abuses by the church. So basically, we want to stop these problems that are going on and sort of rein the religion back into the basics. And that's what's going to happen here. So one of the biggest problems that we're going to see are going to be coming from this something called indulgences. So indulgences are something that you could go and buy from the church. You would give them money. They would give you this little piece of paper that says that you had purchased this indulgence. And basically what it meant for you was that you would not have to spend as much time in purgatory after you die. So it's like a fast pass line at Cedar Point, except it's your fast pass to get into heaven. So if you have the money, you could buy this, and then you won't have to sit in purgatory to atone for your sins. So there's a couple of problems with these indulgences. First of all, you have wealthy people who might not have been the most moral people in the world, who continued some bad behaviors, but it was okay because they were buying these indulgences and they're like, I don't have to deal with that in heaven because I'm going to go straight to heaven because I bought these. So that's one problem. But the biggest problem probably came from the fact that because these are expensive, peasants cannot afford to buy them. So basically what we're saying, if we're selling these to the people, is that the rich people get the fast pass line to heaven, but the peasants, you don't get to. So this becomes an issue, and we're going to have one particular person named Martin Luther, not Martin Luther King, Martin Luther, the guy who starts Lutheranism. He is actually going to rebel against the church. So here's how this goes down. Martin Luther is a very, very devout monk in the church, prays and he fasts and he follows all of the rules. He once actually said that if a monk ever got into heaven by monkery alone, so should I have gotten there. So he definitely followed all the rules, did what he was supposed to. But he looks at the church and he's like, I don't really like the way that things are going. This is a problem. There's a lot of issues, a lot of problems, and I don't like it. So he starts to rebel a little bit. Now, in his town near Wittenberg, Germany, there is a priest who starts to sell those indulgences. This is like the final straw for Martin Luther. He is done. So he goes home and he very furiously writes out something called the 95 Theses. So that's listed right here. These were his arguments against indulgences and other issues going on in the church. It's basically 95 reasons why the church was being terrible right then, and basically the problems that he had. The indulgences are definitely at the top of that list. He feels like it intentionally keeps the peasants out of heaven, and he doesn't like that. So that's his thing. Now, he writes out these 95 Theses, right? And he takes them right to the church, which is sort of in the center of Wittenberg in Germany, and he nails them right to the door of the church. I mean, this is like a very, very obvious protest move, right? It's right there on the church. He's put this on the door of the church, all of these reasons why the church is being terrible. So anybody who comes to church is going to see it. And his thinking is, if he can share these ideas, then more and more people are going to read them, agree with him, and then he can start this little revolution that'll change these problems. So that's basically the plan. Of course, the church, being very powerful, not really on board with his protest here. So basically what's going to happen is the church tells him that he has to come before like a hearing, and he shows up and he's like, hey, what's going on? And the church says to him, look, I don't know what you're trying to pull here, but you are a member of the clergy, you represent the church, so we're going to need you to go tell all those peasants back home that you were wrong and that you're sorry, and you take back or recant everything that you said. Yeah, no, he's not going to do that. He says no, and so the church names him an outlaw, like Old West bad guys outlaw, and they excommunicate him, which of course means that he's kicked out of the church. And when you get kicked out, that means you can't receive the sacraments, you can't have a Christian burial, which of course meant no heaven. So obviously that's a weapon that the church could use against him, and assumed, especially because he was a monk who had followed everything so closely, that he would just say, okay, I'm sorry, and he would take it back. But he doesn't. And so instead what happens is he actually like breaks away from the church and he's like, I'm going to start my own branch. And that's what happens. So this is an old picture of Martin Luther, a painting of him. So now that he has been kicked out of the Catholic Church, he has to figure out what he's going to do next. So he's going to spread his own ideas and begin the religion of Lutheranism. Of course, that still exists today. So first, his biggest thing is he thinks that the average person should not only have access to the Bible, but be able to read it. Because previously, everything was written in Latin. And the only people who could read Latin were the monks and the priests. So basically, the people had to just believe everything that they were being told. And so who knows, inside of all of this corrupt things that's going on in the church, maybe it wasn't always accurate. So the good news is that his ideas are going to spread quite quickly, and he is going to be able to get Bibles into the hands of the average person because of the printing press. So we've already talked about the printing press and how it got started by Gutenberg, and how you could print lots and lots of things in a very short amount of time, especially compared to handwriting them. So he said right here, printing was God's highest act of grace. It allows his ideas to spread very quickly, because those pamphlets, like copies of the 95 Theses, could be printed and printed and printed and spread all throughout the region. And that's basically how his ideas are going to spread. Now, we do see that Luther does get kicked out of the church. There is going to be a revolt in his favor. He is going to have a bunch of peasants who are going to lead a revolt to get him reinstated and back him up and show their support. But they were very, very violent, and he was so not about that at all. He's like, no, and he actually denounces it or puts it down and tells them to stop. because he doesn't want that violence to spread, particularly not in his name. So, okay, Lutheranism gets started. So now we've got the Catholics and we've got the Lutherans, but we are not done yet. We are going to continue to break apart here. So next is somebody named John Calvin. Calvin is going to come from Switzerland. Here is a picture of him. It's a good beard, just saying. He is also going to challenge the Catholic Church because he does not like the corruption that's going on. He also doesn't like some of their ideas. So he's actually going to develop his own method of preaching and his own ideas about the religion and heaven and God. And so he starts to teach this idea called predestination. So if you are destined for something, that's what you're supposed to do. He believed and he taught that God had already decided who would gain salvation, who was going to go to heaven. Like before you would even be born, it was predetermined if you were going to heaven. Now, that doesn't mean that if you were predetermined to go to heaven and then you led an absolutely terrible, horrible life, that you were still going to get in. You could still get put on the no list, but you couldn't go from the no list to the yes list. So I hope that makes sense. So he is going to teach this. He runs his Calvinist churches very, very strict. They had churches that were very simply designed, so very different than those really large cathedrals that we've been looking at that were obviously very ornate. In Calvinism, they had very, very simple churches. Oftentimes they were sort of round, and the preacher would be in the very middle, or his pulpit would be raised up so that he would be up higher than everybody, really supposed to be the focus of attention. They would hang decorations that had coats of arms of the people, and they would decorate with scripture. But that was really the only type of design or organization decoration that you would see inside of these churches. Services would run the length of a day. They would take all day long to go through. So it was very, very strict, and they expected a lot of their members. With the expectation, of course, that you might not even be one of those chosen people, but you had to live your life as if you were, so that if you had been chosen, predetermined, you would be going to heaven because you lived a good life. In addition here, the Swiss state is going to start to run something called a theocracy. So theocracy is actually a type of government where church leaders are also leading the government. So we have that definite overlap. You will use those church ideas when you're creating the laws. So if you're breaking the church rules, it becomes breaking the regular secular ones. So basically it meant that everybody who's in this area was definitely a Calvinist because you had to follow those expectations. But we are not done yet, again. So we need to talk about some other reforms that are going on. We are going to have a third branch of Christianity start, and it's called the Church of England. So I would like to introduce you here to Henry VIII. This is Henry. And Henry is a very interesting character. So Henry actually had been married for a very long time to somebody named Catherine of Aragon. She was this is in England, very, very well loved by the people. They loved Catherine very much. However, during all of their time together, they were not able to have a surviving child. They had one who was a girl. Her name was Mary Tudor. And so they had tried and tried. And of course, when you have a type of government like his, where it gets passed on through the generations, he definitely felt the need to have a male heir to take over. He was not comfortable with the idea that his daughter, Mary, was actually going to be successful in taking over his kingdom after he had died. So he definitely felt the need to have a male heir. Now, Catherine had come from Spain. Aragon is an area in Spain, And, that happened where the different countries would get people together because it built alliances and all those things. So they were married for 18 years, and in this time only had the one surviving child. He definitely felt like this was Catherine's fault, although genetically speaking, I feel like we know today that actually it is the genes from the male that determines the gender of children. So, yeah, not really her fault, but for whatever reason, it's fine. In the midst of all of this, he had a girlfriend on the side. Her name was Anne Boleyn, and he was convinced that he needed to divorce Catherine, marry Anne, and that Anne would have a boy. Utterly convinced. So he goes to the church and he says, I need to get a divorce. Well, the Catholic Church doesn't look very fondly on divorce. In fact, back then it was just flat out not even allowed. So he asked the Pope then, okay, well, can you please annul or cancel my marriage? Like, an annulment is different than divorce. It's almost like you pretend it never happened. Like, let's just pretend we haven't been married for the last 18 years and have a baby together. It's fine. So the Pope is like, well, first, Henry goes to the Pope because he knows that they have actually annulled royal marriages before when it had to do with different agreements with the other countries. But in this case, the Pope is like, dude, no, like, this is a stupid reason for you to get a divorce. I'm sorry. So he refuses. So Henry, being the very hard-headed individual that he was, said, okay, fine. I'm going to leave the Catholic Church and I'm going to start my own religion, and it allows divorce. And so that's what he does. So the Church of England gets formed basically so that Henry VIII can divorce his wife of 18 long years to marry his girlfriend, Anne Boleyn. So that's what happened there. Now, a few years, let's see, right after the annulment, it was 1533. So this is about 6 years. I think it's about 6 years after he initially wanted to divorce Catherine. Anne has a baby because, of course, they get married under the new church. And Anne has a baby, and it's a girl. Yeah, her name's Elizabeth. So at this point, we've created a new branch of Christianity. Today, the Church of England is actually still the official church of England, and because the king here started it, you're going to actually see that today the Queen of England is the head of the Church of England. So even though it's a religion, the monarch is the leader of the church, and that all comes back to him in the 1530s. So yeah, there's more to the story. Of course, it doesn't end here. Why would it? This is such a soap opera. Like, if you ever see those Days of Our Lives and stuff on TV, this is totally Henry's life. So now he has two girls, Mary Tudor and Elizabeth. Mary's a little bit older because he had her earlier in his first marriage. So then he has obviously decided that Anne is also the problem. So he actually gets rid of her. I actually think he has her beheaded. I should probably look that up. I'm pretty sure Anne Boleyn gets beheaded. And then he's going to go ahead and get married 4 more times. 4, count them. So he's married 6 times total. And when he dies in 1547, he has 1 surviving son. 1. Married 6 times, 1 boy. Edward is 9 when Henry VIII dies, and he officially comes to power as king. Of course, the way that the church or the monarch rules are or were back then in England, the oldest male would take over before any of those females. So even though he's 9 and he has older sisters, he's going to become king. So Edward becomes king at the tender age of 9. I think you guys have probably remembered how this has worked out so far in history when we've talked about them. Basically, the king doesn't do anything, right? He has advisors who are basically running all of this stuff for him because he's 9. 9. He doesn't know how to run a country. Think back to King Tut, right? We said that the vizier did everything for King Tut. The advisors are doing everything here for the king. And to complicate matters even more, Edward, who was somewhat sickly, he was not a healthy child. He actually dies in his teens. And so now what? Now, according to the rules of heredity for the king, his oldest remaining, um, Henry's next oldest child would take over the throne, which goes all the way back to the beginning to Mary Tudor. So his very first daughter that he had with Catherine, the woman he divorced, she ends up becoming queen anyways, after all of that, which is just one of those ironic things in history that I can't help but love about history. So she is actually going to try to she tries to get rid of the Church of England and make everyone Catholic again. However, it doesn't really work out. Several years later, when she dies, then Elizabeth, the next daughter, she becomes the queen. So it's just one of those things, you guys. He went through all this trouble to have a boy, and these girls ended up ruling anyways, and they were good. Like, they ruled England very well, and yeah, he drives me crazy. So basically, when Elizabeth becomes queen, she does maintain the Church of England and keeps it basically as it was, because as I mentioned, it still exists today. So we have had 3 different major branches of the Catholic Church break apart. And so if you are in charge of the Catholic Church, you need to take a second and be like, whoa, this is bad. Like, if people are actually leaving, this is bad. So they set up something called the Council of Trent. So this is basically supposed to be a way for a group of the leaders of the church to get together and figure out, how do we go back to the way it used to be? And how do we convince people to stick with us through all of this? So that's what the Council of Council of Trent did for the church. So a group of these priests called Jesuits, the Jesuits still exist today, they form this group together. They get together and they're like, whoa, we got problems. We got to fix this. So this was a religious order of men. They have a very, very strict code of conduct, both in their lives and with their religious practices. So they're really trying to take that step back to the original Benedictine oath that these priests were taking when they became priests. Their idea is they're going to defend the Catholic faith. They're going to say this is the right way to do things. And then they're going to travel and try to actually be a missionary and spread the Catholic Church around. So that was really what their idea was to do. Now, it's not all great. As we start to see higher religious passion, both as people are breaking away from the church and forming their own new version of Christianity, but also as these groups here, like the Jesuits, they're reaffirming their faith, we start to see heightened passion, which is basically making people feel like their way is the only way. And the issue that we have when people start to see things like that very, very passionately is they tend to look at outsiders in a very bad light. And that was what was happening here. So we start to see witch hunts right here. This is literally a time period where people are going out, accusing their neighbors of being witches, going against the church, and they're getting burned at the stake, and they're getting rocks tied to them and throwing them in the river till they drown. It's a really tough time, especially because maybe some of these people might have been performing witchcraft or taking part in their own version of it, but most of them were not. And that's where part of that problem comes in, is that people were using their religion to harm other people in the name of God, and yet that sort of goes against what the religion was originally teaching them. So I hope that makes sense, and how that was a very confusing time. And of course, because if you're Jewish, you are just, it's so bad. It is so bad for them. Jews were getting persecuted, which basically this means, of course, that you are being hunted down, hurt, harmed, killed because of your religious views. In this case, if you were Jewish, that's what was happening to you. So it was definitely a rough time. In terms of this religion, we are also going to see that as science starts to take hold during this time period, which is our next lesson, those people were sometimes also considered witches. And so that turns out bad too, because that's going to hinder some of that development of science that was going on during this time period.